encyclopedic knowledge of the Western tradition, which is great, with so much emphasis in holistic circles upon Buddhism and yoga and shamanism, wonderful as they all are, but we don't want to neglect our Western tradition. So what was it, Leonard, that first brought you to an interest in these topics?
Yeah, thanks, Ralph, and hello, everyone. Yeah, how did it all begin? I would say that it began literally with a bang. The first seed of my esoteric interests, I think, was planted when I was 4 years old. And I was visiting a friend at the time. I was standing at the top of a staircase. 1 second I was at the top of the staircase, and a couple of seconds later I was actually at the bottom, having fallen down or possibly pushed down the stairs. We'll never know. But I was all bloody, and the bottom line was I seemed to have sustained a rather severe head injury. And for years after that, really throughout my early childhood, because of the head injury, I had an array of very strange experiences. Sometimes I would suddenly lose consciousness, apparently for no reason. Sometimes I would lose control of my body, become paralyzed. I would see things, I would hear things, as my poor little brain struggled to heal and rewire. And I got curious about what was going on. I was struck, even as a small child, about the fact that when this got hurt, this brain got hurt, all these other things, my actions and even my thoughts and my feelings and perceptions, somehow were affected. And I would say that is the first thing that really oriented me toward a curiosity about psychology. And so many years later, I ended up getting a Ph.D. in psychology. So that's one of the tracks. But as I got a little bit older from that initial injury, I learned that there were people around who also had weird experiences, and they had not fallen down any stairs or didn't have any kind of known neurological injury. And those were people called people with mental illness. And so I got very curious in the world of psychological disorders. And as I went on in psychology, the study of psychological disorders, mental illnesses, and treatment of those challenges became one of my central areas within psychology. Now I got slightly older still and discovered a third group of people who also reported weird stuff, and no evidence that they'd ever been hit on the head. And in most cases, no evidence that their experiences were linked to mental illness. And that, of course, is the world of the paranormal and the esoteric, and a great range of very strange experiences that highly functioning people in every society and throughout recorded history have reported. And so an interest in those departments, what's called anomalistic psychology and also parapsychology, also became real centers of interest for me. And so, as I said, I think the seed was planted when I fell down the stairs at the age of 4, and all these other things seem to be effects from
So
it.
how did you pursue your interest in these more esoteric matters in parallel with or after your more academic focus?
Yeah, well, that connects, I think, with the second seed that really steered me into this stuff, which happened when I was 9 years old. And that was my first UFO encounter. I was outside. I was actually in the parking lot of a church with a few friends. It was after dark, and we all saw this thing come up over the horizon. It was a brightly glowing pink disc. And without any sound or any kind of drama, this thing just rose over the horizon, went silently overhead. It took a few minutes to cross the sky. And following the pink disc was a triangle of green lights. And so really, if you kind of imagine the structure of the Starship Enterprise from Star Trek, it kind of looked a bit like that. There was this disc followed by a triangle of green lights. And this thing just went overhead. And I have no explanation about it. I make no claims about it. But at that time, a lot of people were talking about flying saucers. This was 1967. And so that really kind of piqued my interest in UFOs. And so I went to the corner drugstore and noticed they had a bunch of paperback, sort of pulp paperback books on flying saucers. So I started buying them and reading them. And then I noticed also on the paperback rack, there were books on numerology and astrology and witchcraft, and they caught my eye. And so I started studying those things and got really curious. I felt a kinship, some affinity with that material. And really the first thing that really hooked me in that department was witchcraft, modern witchcraft. I got very interested in what I was reading about the practices and the beliefs of these witches. I didn't know any in my little hometown of Pickering, Ontario, but I sure was curious about these people who seemed to have a way of worshiping nature in the personification of gods and goddesses and the practice of magic. And that all seemed very alluring and romantic to me. And so what I did about 2 days after graduating from high school, I hopped on a plane and flew to London, England from Toronto, and tracked down a woman named Maxine Sanders. And I'd read about her. And Maxine is was the wife of a fellow named Alex Sanders, who is the co-founder of the Alexandrian lineage of modern witchcraft. So I got a job as a handyman in a hotel in London, England, but spent a lot of my spare time studying with Maxine and learning about witchcraft, and that kind of segued into the study of ceremonial magic. I did come back to Ontario and obviously continued formal studies and got a bachelor's degree and a master's degree and a doctoral degree in clinical psychology. But I always had other interests that I was pursuing. And in fact, very often these other interests intersected with, or I made them intersect with, my more formal conventional studies. So I've always really been kind of had an independent streak, been slightly stubborn in some ways, that if I'm passionate about something, an interest or anything else or anyone else that I'm passionate about, I tend to pursue that passion, even if it cuts across conventional lines and the walls between different disciplines of study, etc. So, and sometimes I'm in trouble, but
tell us a bit as your interests developed, and tell us how your interests evolved in antiquity, especially. And
yeah, that there's really kind of a sequence of, yeah, there's a sequence of how what occupied the center of my attention when it came to esoteric matters. As I mentioned, witchcraft and ceremonial magic was the first one that held my attention during, really my late teens. Then Buddhism actually was the next one that winked at me, and I got very seriously into study and practice of Buddhism, and even at one point spent some time in a Buddhist monastery in Hong Kong. And so that became a center of my interest, and I still continue a practice, a Buddhist practice to this day. A little later on, ancient philosophy started really calling to me. And I think the hook that got me into ancient philosophy had to do with beauty, which is a central topic, particularly in the philosophies connected to Plato. At the time, I was working in a general hospital in Vancouver General Hospital as a clinical psychology, and one of my areas I was working in was the burns and plastic surgery unit. Now that is a unit, one of the last places actually you want to end up, despite the heroism really of my colleagues who work there, the nurses, the doctors, the other health professionals, and the incredibly excellent care. As you might suspect, it's a very dark place. The kinds of injuries, which I leave to people's imagination, but incredible damage to the human form, which usually was highly correlated to incredible relational and psychological challenges. So there actually was a lot for a clinical psychologist to do. And in the face of what conventionally could be called grotesque visions the mutilation and damage of the human form, what began really to attract my attention was the healing power of beauty, and even finding beauty in the heart of that very dark, almost nightmarish kind of situation. There seemed to be something, a kind of opening to a depth in beauty. Beauty not just as a kind of decoration or distraction, but as something profound and potent, and something that sometimes could heal when nothing else actually was therapeutic. And so really kind of looking around, thinking about and trying to deepen my sense of beauty took me into ancient Western philosophy, Plato, and the teachings of the Neoplatonists. Um, One of the important things about the philosophies called Neoplatonism, obviously from the sound of it, they are anchored in the writings of Plato, but people have done a lot of different things with Plato. There's many, many different ways to interpret what Plato was all about. And for the Neoplatonists, really a group of profound thinkers, really the second, third centuries CE and onward to the present day, these Neoplatonists not only studied the teachings of Plato, but they really anchored their study of Plato in direct experience of the deep spiritual realities that Plato was talking about. So it wasn't just an intellectual study for the Neoplatonists, it was very much a personal deepening and a spiritual transformation, which is what they were all about. And again, beauty, a really central feature of all forms of Platonism, I would say. So I would say that my work in burns and plastics was yet another seed of this esoteric, rather
Yes, and when
nonlinear
people think
esoteric path I've been on.
when people think about these esoteric paths from antiquity, it can seem very abstract, but in fact, there's the whole phenomenon of what is called theurgy, which is a kind of practice for the elevation of consciousness that I'm sure you can explain better than I can, Leonard. So could you talk a bit about how some of those ancient practices are relevant to us in our own contemporary spiritual life?
Well, let's jump on the springboard of theurgy for a moment and consider that. So, theurgy is a term for a spiritual orientation that appeared in the ancient world. Probably it originated in ancient Syria in the second century CE. At the time, Syria was a province of the Roman Empire. And so it appears, we're not too sure, but it appears that there was some kind of revelation that happened in Syria at this time, which was written down, codified into a text called the Chaldean Oracles. And this text circulated throughout the Roman Empire. They had really good roads. And so this teaching was studied by people throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. And it struck many of them as what could be called the pinnacle of ancient wisdom of the Mediterranean cultures, the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the Greeks, the Romans. Some of the people who looked at this text called the Chaldean Oracles felt that this was actually the deepest revelation to come out of the whole world of pagan wisdom. And some of the Neoplatonists got onto this, particularly my favorite ancient philosopher, a fellow named Iamblichus, and really tried to use the vision within the Chaldean oracles to create a grand synthesis of ancient pagan wisdom, something that would be relevant not just to the sort of intelligentsia, the highly privileged, literate, rich people who had the leisure actually to engage in deep philosophical study, but also how could he bring in the more common practices, the devotional practices to the old gods and goddesses, and connect them to this overarching vision. And the word for the practice that came out of the Chaldean oracles is this funny word, theurgy. Now, theurgy, if you think about it, listen to it, sounds kind of like another word, theology. And the words are actually related in terms of the Greek roots. The word theology literally means theo, which is God or divine, and logos, which is word. And so what theologians do is they talk about God, they talk about the divine. It's really a kind of intellectual speculation. Theurgy, same first root, theos means divine or God, but the other root, urgia, means activity, actually practicing, doing something. And so in a nutshell, what the theurgists aimed to do was open themselves, open their souls, deepen their souls, change their souls into a kind of receptacle for divine influx, so that their lives, even their daily lives, became, in all of their actions, became embodiments of the flow of divinity as it descended and entered the physical world. And so theurgists aim to be, just as the deities are the creators, the ongoing creators of this world, the theurgists, in this embodying the divine flow, aim to participate in the creation of the universe, so to speak, to bring the gifts of the divine level into the material world. And so that is the mission statement, really, of theurgy. And to me, it doesn't deserve to be left in the dustbin. Frankly, I can't think of anything more relevant than that vocation, that mission statement. The world today is in desperate need of healing. Don't have to emphasize that. And theurgy, I think, is one of the ways that we can think about approaching healing the world. Because really what we're talking about is creation. The divine inflow creates the world. And don't our problems today require almost superhuman creativity to try and figure out how to address these things? So within theurgy, creativity itself is regarded as the manifestation of the divine in human life. And that makes sense to me. All of the issues, political and ecological, that we're all facing, I think require for their solution a sense of connection, as well as selfless creativity. And theurgy talks about a connection between individuals. All sentient beings are connected, and they're also connected to the invisible realms, the esoteric realms. One of the things that Iamblichus wrote about in some of his own surviving writings, and it's a phrase that's always stayed with me since the first time I read it, is the phrase, the communion of all things, the communion of all things. And so that is part of the practice of theurgy, is reaching out in a spirit of communion to all things, things that are available to our senses and the things that are not presented directly to our senses. Now, the word thing might sound a bit cold. Maybe we should come up with a new translation for the communion of all things, because really another aspect of the theurgic attitude is that there are no such things as things in the sense of insentience or the lack of animation. If we perceive deeply, if we cultivate a depth of attention, there's no such thing as a dead body. There's no such thing as an inanimate thing. All things are seething, really, with animation. And so the communion of all things really means the communion of all beings, but we have to recognize everything as a being of some kind.
Okay, let's talk a bit about the whole Western tradition, because I think for many people, some of our viewers today or in future won't really be familiar with it. As I was saying earlier, today in holistic circles, there is so much emphasis upon Buddhism in all its forms, upon yoga, upon shamanism, but the Western tradition, which is filled with beauty, is really, it's in process of being discovered. I gather that the humanities are now rediscovering the Western tradition as a beautiful, it's one of the most dynamic elements in the humanities these days. But can you give us a little bit of an overview, Leonard, of of the Western tradition and how it's evolved. Let's say if we go back to we can always go back early, but let's say if we go back to Alexandria, ancient Alexandria, which was the cultural capital of antiquity, 4 times the size of Rome when Julius Caesar got there. And of course, Cleopatra was the last of the Ptolemaic pharaohs, and it's the home of the Library of Alexandria, which was much more than a library, a birthplace of so many profound philosophies. Tell us a little bit about your sense of the Western tradition, Leonard, and what it has to contribute to complement those other paths today.
Well, Ralph, I'd love to go back to Alexandria, wouldn't you? I think wasn't it 8 years ago that we were last there for the Esoteric Quest is a search for ancient Alexandria, which is quite wonderful. It's true that something important is happening in esotericism today, and one of the challenges is knowing what it is. This word esotericism, esoteric, esotericist, it's used in a lot of different ways to mean different things, and that in itself is a big challenge. One of the ways that I try and keep it in focus is to consider history. What has this word meant? Where did it actually come from? And I think not only can we not really understand esotericism if we don't look in the past, we actually can't understand anything. We can't understand the present without knowing the past. You don't have a chance thinking about the future without knowing the past. So if we look at esotericism and the words kind of around it, it turns out that the things that today we might put under the heading of esoteric, some of them are very old. They do go back to ancient Alexandria and other ancient cultures. Matters like Hermeticism, alchemy, astrology, magic of various kinds, those are very old roots. But it turns out if we look at the historical development of esotericism, a lot of these esoteric topics, what we call today esoteric topics, weren't actually seen as closely related to each other or put into a category called the esoteric until just a few centuries ago. We might stretch the beginning of the linking together maybe about 500 years ago when Hermeticism and Kabbalah and astrology kind of are recognized as linked in some way. But really, it's much more recently that people have talked about esotericism and really seen all of these things as closely related. Now, it's not a coincidence that something else big has happened in the last 500 years, namely the rise of modern science. And we actually can't understand esotericism without looking at that, Western esotericism anyway. So modern science began to take shape and began to develop its own institutional identity, where people would actually talk about a thing called science and people called scientists. And our identities, whether they're individual or institutional, are partly made up of what we exclude from that identity. I am all the things that I am not, in other words. So if I'm a cat, one of the things that means is I'm not actually a giraffe. So if I'm a scientist, what am I excluding in my definition as a scientist? And to make a long story short, a lot of what was excluded in order to create the identity of modern science is what we today call esotericism. You can almost think of all of the topics in esotericism over the last, say, 400 years being put into a great big garbage dump, the scientific garbage dump. And so what is science? Well, it's not all of that stuff that we've rejected. And that came to be called the esoteric. Now, there's an interesting twist to this story. So we have the development and the dominion of the modern scientific worldview. And we have this dumpster over here with all this esoteric material in it. But some people came along and they looked into the esoteric dumpster, and what they found was raw material for another kind of identity, an identity as a student of esotericism or a practitioner of the esoteric. And so there came then to arise this self-conscious identity of someone who belonged to the world of esotericism. And this didn't really come into full focus until a little under 200 years ago. It was in Europe in the kind of early to middle 19th century that even the words like esoteric, esotericism entered modern languages. Startlingly, the word esotericism didn't actually even appear in the English language until the 1880s. And so that's really quite recent in terms of the arc of history. Now, obviously, the things that today we call esoteric, as I mentioned, some of them are very, very old. But the sense of a worldview that we might call esotericism that somehow includes or is sympathetic to alchemy and Rosicrucianism and magic and Kabbalah and all of these orientations is now something available as an identity. And of course, part of the big problem is that if science arose largely by distinguishing itself from the esoteric, and the scientific secular worldview is really a dominant worldview in much of the world, and certainly in the Western world, and certainly in the world of the academic realm of universities and scholars and such, that puts people who are serious about esotericism in a pickle, because there is a deep mistrust, and I would even say, still quite a lot of hostility among the intellectual elites in the Western society when it comes to the matter of esotericism. Now it's beginning to change, and I'm very happy about that. But there's still a lot of resistance, and of course there is, because of the history I just laid out.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's, at the time that remains to us, we've got about another 10 minutes or so. Let's talk a bit more about the Esoteric Quest, which of course has been concerned with the whole history, the whole development of the Western paths. Probably, we've been all the way back to the Greek mysteries. I mentioned the island of Samothrace, where the sanctuary of the great gods was for 1,000 years, one of the great mystery centers of antiquity. Of course, everybody knows Delphi, but we've gone as far back as that period. We've even been to the standing stones of Callanish in Scotland, way, way back in history. But essentially, we've looked at the period since Alexandria, up into, we've been to Iceland, and we've looked at the whole Norse Eddas and sagas and the whole mythology. We've been to the Scotland and looked at the Celtic and other mysteries. We've been to Andalusia and looked at the golden age there, when Sufis, Kabbalists, Christian philosophers were in medieval Spain, and so on. Last year we were in Bulgaria, and as I mentioned, this year we were going to go to Portugal, but we're doing a virtual Esoteric Quest, which Leonard and I will be kicking off on the 23rd of October. So please do go to esotericquest.org. Now, Leonard, I know you speak from more than theoretical experience here, as you actually, I can never resist saying, you met your wife on the Esoteric Quest in Florence, on the Italian Renaissance and the esoteric traditions, the Hermetic, Kabbalistic, and Neoplatonic. What a wonderful event that was. So tell us a bit about your experience on the quest over the years. What would you like to say to our viewers about what they are and what they would get out of experiencing it, even a virtual one?
Yeah, well, as you just more than hinted there, I sure love the experiences that we have at the Esoteric Quest. They can certainly be life transforming, and that one 20 years ago in Florence certainly was a transformative experience for me. That phrase, esoteric quest, I believe it was Christopher McIntosh coined that, wasn't it? And Christopher is, perhaps just about the most experienced presenter when it comes to these 20-year series that you've created, Ralph. Another thing to note about Christopher McIntosh and others is that he is one of the people who've managed to bring scholarly rigor into the academic world when it comes to exploring esoteric matters. And many of the other presenters in the Esoteric Quest also have been very valuable in that regard. We have Jocelyn Godwin, we have Angela Voss, we have Marjorie Roth, we have Nicholas Goodrick Clark. These people have all played an important role in legitimizing the study of Western esotericism in the sort of previously hostile halls of academia. But to the esoteric quest itself, one of the things that resonates very much for me about even the phrase esoteric quest is, again, it's centered on experience. A quest is an experience. And each of these fantastic events that you've created for us over the last 2 decades, all around the world, really have been filled with the opportunity for experience. But of course, a quest, an esoteric quest, is an interesting thing, because when I think and feel and experience such things, a real esoteric quest begins with a kind of noticing, with a shift of attention. We see the situation that we're in, and something about it makes us uneasy. There's something going on that we feel we're missing, or the current situation is too small, and we get uneasy, we get restless, and then something beckons to us. We get an intuition that there's more going on than this situation that we find ourselves in our lives. And we respond to this mysterious beckoning that seems to be coming from outside of our ordinary awareness or ordinary life by going on a quest. Now, the quest can be an actual journey, a physical journey. It can be, it doesn't always have to be, but it always has to be a journey inside. And then we go on this quest, and then there's some kind of outcome. The interesting thing about an esoteric quest, unlike some other kinds of quests, is that an esoteric quest never leaves us in any sort of final resolution. An esoteric quest always will lead to another beckoning and another quest and a continuous spiraling, deepening enrichment of life. And so these events that have been happening over the last 20 years that I've been so privileged and enriched by being part of are little booster shots, in effect, that I think help to feed this energy that keeps going in between the events, for sure. As we all go back to our daily lives, we're not quite the same as we were. And the transformation and the exploration, I really do think they continue. And so here we are now celebrating 25 years. I've been involved for 20, but of course, you know, the first one was in 1995, 25 years ago. And so I just think, what a legacy. How many lives have been touched? How many lives have been changed? And this energy is going to keep rolling through the decades, maybe through the centuries, continuing to transform. And so again, you know, experience is really the central thing. And I think it would be fun to have a forum and have the veterans who participated in the esoteric quest. And of course, I don't just mean presenters, because everybody who goes to these things is a participant, right?
Yeah.
The esoteric quest isn't just about head stuff any more than theurgy is just about head stuff.
Yes.
And
I
so,
always say that, go ahead, Leonard.
yeah, I was just going to say, we go to these things, and yes, you know, thanks to your care, there is intellectual rigor in the presentations, and I value that, and it's extremely important. But also the food and wine are great, and that's at least as important. The conviviality, the getting together and forming a community. It's the communion of all beings in a nutshell there, and actually going to the places where insights arose surely helps to participate in those old insights as well. But, you know, I'd love to see a forum where these veteran participants get together and kind of we talk about what happened to us and for us and between us. And, you know, I'm quite curious about people's favorites and such.
Yes, and we are actually doing a T-shirt too, which will have all the marking the 25th anniversary. That will have all of them with all the extraordinary locations on the back. So we hope to make that available in the next few weeks for people. Yeah, so just talking again about the upcoming quest, the virtual esoteric quest. You know, I would say the ingredients of the quest are the quality of learning. We always bring in the best possible presenters, and I'm sure viewers can tell from listening to Leonard and to Steve Bass last week speaking about his book on beauty, memory, unity. We have many wonderful presenters on the quest. So there's the quality of learning, there's the conviviality that Leonard mentioned that is so important. Of course, we have to do that online this time, but there'll be happy hours every day, and there'll be breakout sessions as well, so we can meet other people. Because if we were going to a real quest, of course, we would be meeting people and having some of that lovely food and wine. But we'll have to bring that to our computer screens on the 23rd, rather than actually being in some Portuguese restaurant. And it's the arts too. The arts are another important factor here. And so we will have in the virtual quest, we'll have beautiful music from the Languedoc, the world of the troubadours and cathars, century south of France. We'll have music from Iceland. It was an extraordinary thing when we did our Icelandic quest on the mysteries of the North. The beautiful music. I mean, people know about Björk, but Icelandic is such an amazing font of creative music these days. And we will have Angela Voss, as you mentioned, speaking about the music and playing us some of the music of the Renaissance of Marsilio Ficino and the Hermetic and Neoplatonic views of correspondences. So it's going to be very, it'll be experiential and multidimensional. You know, the esoteric quests are really a holistic approach to esotericism. They're to do with the whole person. And as Leonard was saying, you emerge from a quest, you feel it in your whole body. This is not an intellect, purely a spiritual experience. It's a full experience. So as we close out, Leonard, would you like to say a few words about the talk you're going to give on the first day, Friday the 23rd in the afternoon? You're going to be speaking about forms of the quest. Could you say a few words about that?
I would like to take the opportunity of the 25th anniversary to try and draw some themes together, some more general themes that come up when we're talking about esotericism and the esoteric quest. So that's what I'm going to be talking about, the forms of the quest. There is, in my understanding, a basic pattern when we're talking about an esoteric quest that I just touched on, the notion of noticing and then a kind of unease, a beckoning, responding to that beckoning by going on a quest, and then a kind of outcome that is like an Ouroboros, the snake biting its own tail, because it leads right back into another exploration. And so that seems to be an underlying pattern, a kind of spinal cord to the whole thing. But there are many different forms, many different embodiments of that basic pattern. So I hope to use my time next month to explore that pattern and some of the forms a little bit.
Okay, Leonard. So look, for our listeners, this time, 1 o'clock New York time on Thursdays, between now and October 23rd, when the quest begins, we are going to do, or I'm going to do, a series of interviews. So we mentioned Steve Bass, Leonard today. Next week will be Ellen Goldberg, who is a longtime presenter at the Quest too. She is an expert on the tarot, among other things, but she views the tarot as a compendium of archetypal images from the Western tradition. And so this will be, for those of you interested in that, we'll be going into that. And I think there will be another interview, I think it's very likely, with Christopher Bamford, a wonderful expert on Rudolf Steiner and another encyclopedic being on the Western tradition. And I'm going to get in touch with Christopher McIntosh, who you mentioned earlier, who has been speaking at the Quest since the very beginning, the first one in Český Krumlov, the southern Bohemian mecca of alchemists, way back in 1995. Little did I know at that point that it would launch a 25-year series and counting. So for those of our viewers who have joined us for quests over the years, because this one is online and virtual, we're really asking everybody to help us get the word out. So for those of you who I'm sure most of you have personal networks of friends who have interests in these matters. So, you know, as anybody can participate in this quest anywhere in the world, if they have a decent Wi-Fi connection, we are asking everybody to please help us get the word out by reaching out to their constituency. And as I say, the website went live. You can find it through the Open Center's site. Just put in the Esoteric Quest. in the search engine, or if you go to Esoteric Quest, that will direct you to a new website. This time we're using a whole new online structure or platform called Hey Summit. So this is an exploration for us too, and we really invite you all to help us make this work, because these have been outstanding events over the years. And Leonard, it's been great to have you as part of them. And yeah, let's. I think Marjorie would be a good topic too. Marjorie Roth, Leonard's wife, who is an expert in esoteric music and who just presented or produced a conference on esotericism in music at the college upstate where she teaches. So every Thursday at 1 o'clock between now and October 23rd, there will be these 45-minute conversations with really some of the most knowledgeable and fun presenters that we have in this tradition, and that the Quest has been very fortunate to feature for all these long years. So, Leonard, I wish you a good day. Thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it. And yeah, please tell all your friends and connections about the online Quest. All right, so thanks everybody, and we'll see you same time, same place, 1 o'clock on Thursdays next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.